Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. I remember the hopes we all had when the United Nations Charter was ratified, and I'm still thrilled when I pass the headquarters with all its flags waving. But when we look at the world, we can't help but wonder if it failed in its promise or we failed in our commitment. Evelyn Leopold is the Reuters bureau chief at the UN, and I'm anxious to hear what she thinks about this. Am I wrong in saying, well, you said before, people who are older have a different concept of what the United Nations was supposed to do.
Yes, it was the hope after World War II,
Yeah.
built on the ashes of World War II, the House of Peace. The world's gotten more complicated, and it's not a world government, it's a space.
It's interesting.
Where governments meet and sometimes can do something and sometimes cannot, because they bring with them all the self-serving interests that they have at home.
Yeah. That's a very interesting point, because we've supported. I mean, grew up as a world federalist, right? The world should have one government. We should all be living at peace and well-being. I mean, we didn't even think about developing underdeveloped nations or any of that kind of problem.
But I mean, there's very little known about what it does and what it does not do. And in the last decade or so, the right wing has been absolutely rabid about all these dreadful foreigners with their parking tickets and whatever. And, you know, they can do nothing right, and it's corrupt from top to bottom. And you know, to find something wrong with the United Nations it's a wonderful whipping boy. I mean, Bob Dole found that out in his campaign, and you know, now I don't think it'll be in a campaign. But
did Bolton have that attitude?
Bolton was too clever for that. For a journalist, Bolton was God's gift, because he answered every question all the time, where most ambassadors often just speak, and Bolton would answer what you asked.
And right off of it.
Right. I mean, what most diplomats say is that he was not exactly wrong on the issues, but the tactics were, you know, he was pushing people on tactics.
I resented it, and I suppose that still there's a group of us who believe that international treaties and cooperation is what should be. I mean, that's the only way we're going to get through, I think, what's the turmoil that faces us.
Right, and there are a lot of treaties, and we haven't signed any for a long time. Not even the rights of the child. We say it conflicts with states' rights, and this is all governments, not just Republicans, though they're more vocal about it.
Have we supported the CEDAW, you know, the women's...
Yes, parts of it,
Parts,
but again, we don't want anything that's obligatory that will conflict with any of our local laws, because a treaty means you have to change your national legislation, and it has to be passed by the House and the Senate, and it's a serious thing. And the one thing about the United States as a whole, on most treaties, doesn't sign anything it doesn't think it can abide by.
And that's interesting.
And rather than just say, oh, we're all for women's rights, well, we can't sign this, you know, this is going to conflict, or we haven't gone this far in our national legislation, or our national legislation has gone further. For example, right now, it's not a treaty, but they're negotiating what the UN should do, or a memorandum of understanding with peacekeeping nations, with all nations, to stop any sexual abuse, or what happens if you find it, and who gets investigated. And we and a number of other countries are very careful that the UN investigators don't have many rights. And yet our own, when they work, our own rules for soldiers are much tougher.
Do we have members in the UN peacekeeping unit?
No more. We used to. No more. We have a few hundred, and they're like military observers.
I guess we're so busy recruiting for our own army.
Yes, and we're inside peacekeeping things, like in NATO, in Kosovo, we were there, and in Afghanistan, with a separate force, and we stopped joining the main UN peacekeeping. In fact, you'll find right now it's made up very largely of developing nation soldiers, except for Lebanon, where you do have the French, the Italians, and so forth.
Is that similar in a way to the people who join our army, in that they see that as I'm not saying all the people, but a lot of young people see that as a path and a road to future
countries get paid, not right away, but eventually they get paid. That's what our dues and other, not dues, but peacekeeping contributions and other countries, wealthy countries' contributions go for. We are the largest single payer, but we're paying below our ability to pay. We keep getting lowered at our insistence. We're paying 22%. Japan, which has a much lower GDP, is paying 20%, 19%. So, and the European Union as a whole, all 25 of them collectively pay about 40%. So that's where the money is. So in the world today, it's over.
Does that hurt our reputation and what people think about us in the rest of the world?
Well, no, other things do. Other things do. Yeah, right. I mean, whatever we do has a reaction, and sometimes it has a visceral one. If the U.S. says it is so, it has to be wrong. We're not always wrong. We aren't wrong on Sudan. For example.
Right. Yeah. Did the originators of the United Nations miscalculate the importance of each country's nationalism and nationalist pride?
I think so. I think it was to prevent a world war, and maybe it has, simply because people have a place to come and talk.
Right.
It hasn't prevented a lot of other wars since the end of the Cold War.
Right.
It hasn't. Then all sorts of nationalistic aspirations came to the fore. Look at the Balkans in Europe. Yeah.
I have always been impressed by the research that's available from reports and this stuff, and just child care or early childhood education. Most of it seems to me so much valuable work is done at the United Nations.
Extremely, and they'll often hire outside experts. I mean, look at the climate.
Yeah.
It's not like the UN has a climate bureau that is just doing their research. It's that they have enough people that they know who to hire around the world and engage in these global warming reports.
So that's a very important function, isn't it?
Yeah. And that's headquartered, strangely enough, in Nairobi, because it's scattered all over the world.
Yeah. It's so it's a resource for countries.
It is a resource, and it's a place to meet, and it can impose, like the Security Council, it can impose mandatory penalties, like it just did on Iran, on North Korea, and so forth.
Did the people at the UN realize how the Bush administration was manipulating to get into Iraq?
Oh yeah. That was, I mean, that's why we had all sorts of boycotts of French wine.
Yeah. It's so
oh no,
stupid,
France led the way, but you see, if it were only France and it was isolated with Russia and China, they couldn't have done it. But they had the Latin American countries on the council with them, they had the African countries with them. They, if the veto power weren't there, we didn't have the 9 votes, the minimum you need out of 15. You need a minimum of 9.
Of the Security Council.
Of the Security Council, which has 15 members, 5 with veto power. But you still need 9 positive votes for any resolution. We didn't have it. Sometimes, some days we did, but most of the time we had 8.
Yeah.
And maybe even less. And, when Chile and Mexico said no way, that was it, But of course, France had the veto power, and when Villepin told Colin Powell, we're going to vote no matter what you do. But no, that occupied the entire UN.
That must have been infuriating, though, and really shocking. I'm always amazed at the control diplomats most often have. I think Bolton is the one who didn't have that much control, right?
They all have to go back to their governments. Yeah. They all have foreign ministers.
No, I just mean their personal control.
Yeah.
How angry you must be.
Yes.
But you don't, it doesn't reflect in my world of reading the paper and seeing what's going on.
Exactly. No, they're often, I think the anger over the lead up to the Iraq War got to be public,
Yeah.
That was the first time where you didn't see the gentleman have, we will be seized to the issue, and all the other funny talks and hieroglyphics and stakeholders and gender mainstreaming and the other things that if we wrote about them, the rest of the world would say, what in heaven's name are they talking about? But it's a funny English.
How do you think the members of the Senate were so fooled? I mean, how do you explain their votes? Can you explain that?
No, I can't.
Yeah.
I think the administration made a good case. I think the one thing they didn't listen to on the nuclear is that the International Atomic Energy Agency was saying we can't find it. And they had been monitoring Iraq for a long time. And that's easier to monitor because you need big stuff and you can also get radiation from the air.
Right. Oh.
And so, you know, that's it. The chemical and the bioweapons are much more difficult. You know?
Yeah.
But the missiles, you can hide them in the sand, but not too long. But the ballistic missiles and the nuclear stuff is just not that difficult to find. And my feeling was all along that he wasn't trying to blow us up when he started his nuclear program.
Yeah, right.
It was during the Iran-Iraq War.
Right.
They want to be, it's same thing with Iran, they want to be the big man in the Middle East and face each other, you know. We wouldn't have minded blowing us up. I mean, Saddam Hussein is not Ho Chi Minh, but you know, but
it was so amazing to me because I mean I knew that this was wrong. My friends all knew this was wrong, but there's a mystique, isn't there, in politics? And I suppose it must be the same in politics at the United Nations because it's basically all the same. That there's a certain, I don't know, what is it that there's a
you trust the intelligence that you're given, you know.
Well, why aren't they suspicious?
Because how would you know? You're not there
know.
looking
Is
at
there
it. I mean, the
suspicion
UN
that
did not say no, he has nothing,
right.
except in the nuclear ones.
Right.
There they say we're not totally sure, but we're pretty sure. But the other stuff, they were hedging because they were thrown out. They hadn't inspected. So, you know, you do trust your government to say we've discovered from the sky, from the world, there are all these things.
When you went with Reuters to the United Nations, you were with Reuters, but you had been someplace else.
I had been I was news editor for North America, then I was editor in Africa. And so I lived in Nairobi and was sort of in charge of our 8 bureaus there. And then I came back here to the UN, because in my company you reshuffle things very often. Right.
And was it hard to grasp this huge bureaucracy?
Yes, it was terrible. I hadn't covered the State Department, so the whole language was awful.
Right.
I had a wonderful colleague, Anthony Goodman, who died last year, who taught me a lot of different things, as did friends from the BBC and other competitors, because my learning curve was very high. I think it was 6 months before I felt I could be alone for an hour. You know?
And find your way around.
Well, it was a very busy time.
Yeah.
You know, there were several wars the UN was handling. You know, there was Gulf War, there was the entire Iraq scene, Cambodia going on, Somalia, Bosnia just starting. I mean, the former Yugoslavia. So that there were a lot of things to keep track of,
and then at the same
time,
language
that you didn't quite understand,
right.
And you had to coordinate with your own staff in the field that may have a much more realistic or at least different picture.
And then at the same time, not only what's happening in the world, but what's happening behind the scenes in the offices of the UN itself, with its reports and its information and all that stuff.
I think we neglected, until the Oil for Food program, we neglected quite a bit of what happened in the UN bureaucracy. The main reason was that you had real wars there and Rwanda genocide. So what do you care about what's going on internally when you can, with 2, 3, 4 people, you hardly get through.
Yeah. And like any other bureaucracy, it grows and grows and grows, and it's like maturing.
It's not a very big one.
Suddenly you get too old.
It's not too big. I mean,
how many people are at the United Nations?
Nobody knows. I mean, in New York, there are several thousand, but they're scattered all over the world, and the Secretary General doesn't control it all. They're independent and semi-independent agencies. Like the World Meteorological Agency is not controlled by anything in New York. It's an affiliate, and although the Secretary General may have some kind of honorary post there, UNICEF is semi-independent, and you know, and so it goes. So that there's very limited power there in the center. What he does control is the bureaucracy in New York, Geneva.
Where do paychecks come from, do you know? Each location of where you are?
Well, if you're in what they call the Secretariat, the main bureaucracy, they probably come from New York. Yeah.
May I see? I'm sorry, I wanted to look at your hands. Now, what is that? That is so beautiful.
That is a henna tattoo.
Yes.
Because I was in Sudan all of last week, Ronnie, because my colleague, the Reuters bureau chief there, young woman named Ophira McDoom married a Sudanese, and this is called wedding henna. And all her girlfriends gathered, and the sisters of her husband gathered the day of, I can't say the day of the wedding. The wedding was an entire week. I don't know which day they really got married, you know. And because you don't stand in front of the altar and say, I do. And
they have male, female,
well, no,
everything?
the men go to the mosque. The bridegroom's in the back, and the two fathers have signed papers. And so the bride's not there, and the bridegroom's hardly there, although they certainly are very
And this is a
independent
strong
people.
young woman, a feminist.
It's a strong young woman, a very liberated woman, a woman who's been arrested 3 times by the Sudanese government in Darfur, and who writes very fair, balanced stories, and a very beautiful young woman who has done this, has fallen in love with a Sudanese, who's got this large family and this large house, and about between 1,500 and 2,000 people were at different parts of the wedding ceremony. And her family, who lives in Britain, were and she is British, and they were just, they said, we're very underrepresented here,
And this was in Khartoum.
This was in
Khartoum. Which is part of the Sudan.
Which is the capital.
Which has in Darfur is part of Sudan.
Right, which is many miles to the west.
So you had a wedding of how many people?
1,400 or so, yeah. I mean, one night was 1,400, then the women alone, when all this was done, was about 800.
And they were all fed every day?
They were fed constantly. Well, I like the way you're fed. You don't have big plates of things. You sort of have a buffet and you nibble all evening. You don't have this plate that's given to you.
But the contrast, right, between that wedding and
the contrast
Darfur
is unbelievable, and she wrote about it.
Yeah.
Because she wrote a piece for Reuters about her own wedding and
what
what
did
it's
she
like
say?
to have family and fall in love. And she said that, she has spent most of her 3 years in Sudan writing about misery, and this was a totally new thing for her to find out about family life and the closeness of it, despite all the problems.
I was wondering
every color in the rainbow was at this wedding,
And we know how much a wedding here costs.
I would
just
think
for one evening.
I would think.
Are prices comparable there?
No, they are less, because you do have a lot of cheap labor. But
Right.
I think that we were guessing. We don't know. We're much too polite to ask. We were guessing about 400,000, 500,000, because it went on for a week. But I don't know.
Did you pay your own hotel bill?
Yes, no. We paid
everybody
our hotel,
paid their own
but they
expense.
came with cell phones for us and all sorts of
So
things.
amazing.
And made sure we were picked up at the airport and had a whole folder of stuff. Because there were events every single day, afternoon and evening.
Isn't it? It's very exciting. So you must be exhausted.
I'm terribly exhausted. I just got back,
It must be hard to go there. Were you exhausted when you got there? Isn't that traveling is the hardest when you go
Traveling's
east?
the hardest anyway when you go east.
Yeah.
I went over Dubai, and going there wasn't too bad. Coming back was bad because the planes were delayed, because on the edge of the airport, an ammunition truck blew up near an ammunition dump. Don't ask me what it's doing at the edge of the airport. Maybe a future coup, I don't know.
You hear people, just trying to relate the international to local, people used to say, oh, I can't come to New York City, it's so dangerous. And I would think,
right.
What are they talking about? Is that a similar kind of thing in Africa? We hear about all the terrible things.
Sometimes some cities are. Khartoum is not. People do not feel they get robbed there.
Yeah.
They thought the Sudanese I knew who were there, working for the UN, and I was speaking to the young women, they thought it was rather stupid that I was looking for a safe, because they don't, thanks to our sanctions, you can't use a credit card. So that I was using, I had a lot of cash, which you're totally unused to in New York, where you throw your plastic around, and or in most of Europe. So that I put money into a safe, and they said, you won't need to, it won't be touched.
So the sanctions are the United States or the UN?
United States. UN has very mild ones. It's very hard to get them through.
Well, how do people who are in Khartoum, how do they live with the fact that Darfur is so close to them?
It's not that close. It's
not.
quite a ways. No,
and it's like a different part of the world.
Well, they have lived with the North-South fight, affected them much more, because that was the future of the country and break away, and it still does.
And the North-South was what? The Arabs versus Christian, or?
Yes, and versus that was Muslim and Christian, and African and Arabs, and they're all African, you know, and you often cannot tell them apart. And then in the West it is African, Arab, and they're all Muslim.
So when we say Arab, is that what? That, I mean, who is everybody the same color?
No, but they're
Christians
darker in Sudan, let's say, than they are in Egypt or Tunisia or Morocco.
Right.
But then even there, you know, this is not a world where you
nationality,
where you have Hitler's standards of how light
what do
and
you
dark
call
you
it?
are.
How do you distinguish them if it's in a country? They're all Sudanese, but some of them are Arabs and some of them are Christians. That's just by the religion, not by color?
Well, yeah, most of the Arabs are Islamic, and they have been for many, many years, since the Ottoman Empire. In the West, the Africans have been converted, and in the South, they're animist or Christian, as is most of East Africa. And they, you know, the southern part looks like it should have been in Uganda or Ethiopia just by the topography and the people. But they all speak Arabic, you know, regardless of the religion.
So
and the army sort of outsources. It does it in Darfur and it did in the South, you know. It'll arm the local militia and their allies there, and then they can loot, rape, take slaves or whatever.
It's so complicated. You know? How are we ever going to, what's going to happen?
I really don't know. I mean, Sudan allegedly has said they'll allow an interim package. This was yesterday. There was the Sudanese ambassador brought me a note that was distributed in Addis Ababa, but there's still,
is that what the UN has recommended?
Well, there are 3 stages. One stage is already there in support of the 7,000 African Union troops. And then there's another stage, the second one, called the heavy stage. I don't know why, the heavy plan. It's not a heavy plan. It's 3,000 auxiliary logistic people, not really boots on the ground.
But UN
people. Help. And then, well, UN recruited people. There are no UN troops.
Right.
And then then there's the main thing that we're all looking at, the 20,000 on the ground to guard the refugee camps and so forth in Darfur. And that is where the problem is going to be. And that's where the UN's getting nickeled and dimed to death on that. And Sudan feels a matter of pride that
they don't want
that it should be able to protect its own people, no matter what that means.
Is it interested in protecting its own people?
Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there are skirmishes between Chad and Sudan?
Yeah, well, the borders are, it's a big border, it's not very clear. The Chad-Darfur border, the tribes are the same, and the Janjaweed, whom we've known as the vicious bandits, you know, on horseback, all cross over chasing their prey into Chad. And Chad support Sudanese rebels in Darfur, and they support each other's rebels, and it's the refugee camps and the displaced people camps in Chad are a very sad sight, kept alive mainly by the UN Refugee Agency.
Now, what about the food? The United States, they're arguing in the Senate, right, about the food that we send to Africa for relief has to be American grown. Is that what it is?
Yes, which doesn't make any sense because you should be helping them grow their own food.
Right. So is it it's our farmers' lobby? Is that what it is?
Well, it's all of our aid.
All
of our aid, and so do a lot of other countries. But ours, since it's in dollar amounts, pretty large, our aid all has strings attached that has to be shipped on American vessels sometimes, which means there goes half the weight. You know, and how much really gets to people is appalling. But we do give a lot through the World Food Program, the UN agency, which does know how to
And
get
do they
the
buy
place.
locally?
Unless there's string attached, they'll buy locally, or depends on, you know,
they're
great storehouses of corn, much of which is ours. You will notice the World Food Program head is always an American. And so much of it is ours.
From here.
But and you know, we're rather generous to some of these agencies. It's not always skimping. It's just our total aid is a small part of our wealth, but there's certain areas where we've been very generous.
I think it's just amazing that one is able to grasp everything that goes on at this organization.
You don't. You just hope that you've got it right.
It's just unbelievable.
And that little piece that you're writing about that day is accurate.
How is it being a woman at the United Nations?
Oh, there are plenty of us. Among the press, there are more women. Most of the leading organizations have women.
And the delegations?
Delegations are pretty bad. On the upper level, the ambassadors, they're very bad. I mean, there may be about 13 out of 100 and something, 192 who are maybe 20 who are the top ranking of the mission. Every mission has a woman in it, but...
And do they respond to you as well as to the men in the press? There's no problem with that?
No, none whatsoever.
Right.
Depends what language you speak. That's a problem. None of us speak enough languages.
How many languages do you speak?
I speak a bad French and a good German. But German's not a UN language, But I can read French at least. But I wish I had Spanish, Russian, and Arabic. I'd be on easy street.
Do you think the world is better off because of the United Nations?
Yeah, I think you have to have a meeting place that's easy. You don't just pick up the phone. Condi doesn't pick up the phone and call 192 countries. And we like the United Nations when it does what we want. And we have given it many problems. Bush 1 got out of the Reagan entanglement in Central America, and it all went to the UN, with the U.S. watching very carefully how it was resolved, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, all ended up there, rather than the U.S. doing it alone. And there are many other incidents, from East Timor to that we don't want to get involved in that, but you don't want a war there, neither do other major countries. And so the UN is a good place to do it. I mean, negotiate the end of the Iran-Iraq war, got Namibia independent from South Africa. There are all sorts of things that happen over the years where we're very glad to pay for it, because if we had to do it alone,
it would be too hard.
It would be too expensive, it would be too hard, and too much unrest.
We've come to the end of this program, which I can't believe, because I still have so many questions.
Well,
but it sounds like you lead a most exciting life.
Well,
and that I'm glad that you think that the UN is something that we need.
Yeah.
And I hope that people will pay attention to it and look at it. Do you have a website? There's a Reuters website?
There's a Reuters website,
right.
Yeah. And I haven't been writing much lately because I've been
at the wedding.
Because I've been at the wedding. But but my colleague wrote all about her own wedding,
That's good. So thank you very much, Evelyn, and lots of good luck. Thank you.
Bye.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.